Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malfers Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to episode 68 of the Church Revitalization Podcast. Glad to be with you again this week. Hey, Scott, how are you?
Hello, AJ Matthew, my friend. Glad to be communicating with you.
Today's topic is 3 principles for better leadership communication. We talk with a lot of pastors and leaders, and we witness them communicating with their staffs and ministry teams quite a bit. We've kind of picked up on a few things that we see could be improved, haven't we, Scott?
We see the good, the bad, and the ugly. Lots of bad and ugly, a little bit of good.
So the problem with, and of course, this is not a church thing. I mean, humans in general need to communicate well. Of course, this is a whole business. There's a whole genre of writing and podcasts and all this in business and marketing. If you don't communicate clearly, you will not get the result that you desire from what it is that you're communicating. People need to understand, especially when you're talking leadership, people need to understand your directives. They need to understand mission and vision, and a lack of clarity in the church, we're saying, will lead to a delay, at least a delay, if not a complete mess of doing effective ministry in your church. If you can communicate clearly with your ministry leaders, ministry will happen sooner and return greater fruit.
That's right. Yeah. In good old Donald Miller language, he would say, if you confuse, you'll lose. And that's true in leadership. In 1 Corinthians 14:8 says, if the trumpet gives an uncertain sound or doesn't give a clear sound, who's going to prepare for battle? And that's exactly the case. We see this in churches all the time. In fact, I was just on the phone with a particular church leader from a particular church just a few days ago. He called me. He said, I'm really confused. The pastor said X, Y, Z. Does this line up with what you all had discussed? And I had to I work with a lot of churches, so I had to scratch my head a little bit and think about it and go, okay, that sounds about right, but you really should talk to him, talk to the pastor, because I'm not in charge of your church. So it's very common for us to make decisions in meetings, and then there need to be some adjustments after the meetings. So if you have a question, probably you should talk to him, not to me. So, this communication issue is really important, and I think it's holding a lot of churches back. I think some pastors, AJ, fancy themselves as good communicators because they're good at sermons, writing sermons. And just because you're good at speaking from a platform or from a stage doesn't mean that you're good at speaking in a boardroom or, over coffee or through email.
Yeah.
So we're talking about that leadership communication, AJ, not, your bulletins on that level or from the stage from that level. We're talking about you as the leader communicating with other leaders.
Yeah.
That's the focus.
Well, even some of those sermons, I mean, we've probably all, seen a charismatic speaker and, you're engaged while it's happening. And then later you might be like, what did he really say? Or what did that really mean? Once you've got a minute for it to sink in, you're like, did I really come across with anything useful today or not? Was it just a fun illustration that he had? So, I think a lot of pastors maybe think in the volume that they're communicating, not in sound level, but in the amount of words that they're using, the amount of emails they're sending, or the amount of time they're taking up in a staff meeting, that is good communication, and more is not always better. So clarity wins over quantity.
I hear this a lot. I hear it a lot. I've heard it a lot this year. Pastor is a really good preacher, but he's not a very good leader or communicator.
Yeah.
It happens a lot. And I think that to some degree, AJ, it's because seminary didn't train you to be good at leading. They trained you to be good at preaching.
Sure.
And so you got what you paid for from the seminary. Thankfully, this podcast is free, so you're also going to get what you paid for with this podcast, but hopefully it will help you.
And we don't have an exhaustive list for you today. We don't have 99 points on better communication. This is not our latest book, but we do have
three solid ones.
We've got 3 good principles for you, and I think these will help you. The first one is communicate promptly. So when something needs to be said, it needs to be said, right, Scott?
Yeah, I would draw you back to, I don't remember which episode, you have to go back and look, but look at our sort of time management, mastering your calendar episode that we did. And a whole third of your time needs to be delegated or allocated to dealing with administrative issues. And included in that is communication, replying to correspondence. And I think that a real problem for pastors is not replying. They have emails, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but maybe emails they don't want to reply to.
Right.
And so they don't, and or they don't do it quickly. And then it becomes like that email gets a little age on it. It's a day old, a week old, 10 days old. And at that point, it becomes too awkward to reply to.
Yeah.
If you reply to an email that's 2 weeks old and you weren't on vacation, if you eventually reply to it, it means that you were thinking about it for 14 days and just decided to reply to it. You don't find a 14-day-old email, right? You have to keep scrolling to find that thing. So same thing with texts. It's a thing that the kids say, AJ, left on read. Yeah.
Huh?
You haven't heard this?
You just lost me. You're not communicating.
All right. Let me educate all of the old people listening to this podcast. Sometimes people have read receipts on their text messages. So it will say read. If you see a text message or a Facebook message or an Instagram direct message or whatever, and you read it and then you don't reply to it, that is leaving someone on read. Like READ, left on read.
Gotcha. Okay.
And that's offensive to people. Like, I know you saw it. It says read.
Yeah.
And then you didn't reply to it. Or even worse, you see it and they see that you see it and you get those 3 little ghosty dots, right? Showing that you're replying, and then no message ever comes through because you got scared. You have to reply to things promptly, AJ. You have to deal with it. Now, in our time management episode, we said that doesn't mean instantaneous, but it does mean that day. If you get an email, reply to it that day. You could sometime in the morning or sometime in the afternoon. It doesn't need to be instantaneous, but it should be that day. Deal with it promptly. It only gets harder to reply to it the longer you wait. Yeah.
Deciding not to make a decision about something is making a decision about something. So things just left out there in the ether, that's not healthy or effective for anything. So
people hate it. Don't you hate it?
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not good.
All right. That was good, man. Communicate promptly. There you go. Principle number 2, stop couching your communication in feel good language. This again, and people can see through this once they get to know you. You might have them fooled for a little while, but they're going to pick up on your patterns. And if you're always kind of like, well, let's think about that. Let's pray about that. Just stop.
Yeah. Be direct. Just be direct. Say, no, I don't think that's a good idea. Like if someone says something and they say, and you say, that's a good idea. Let's think about that. But what you're really thinking is that's a terrible idea and we'll never do that. You don't have to be rude, but you should be direct. You can say, I don't think we're going to do that. Even that might be couching. Just say, we're not going to do that.
Well, I mean, here's a good scapegoat for you. Go through a process in your church in which you establish clear mission and vision. And then
you got some strategic envisioning?
Excellent built-in scapegoats. You're like, that definitely doesn't fit in with the vision that we're after. Remember those? Remember the meeting where we talked about our 3 points of vision? So at least have solid mission and vision as a scapegoat for you, but don't, come on, leaders have to lead. And sometimes those are tough conversations. Now, and I would be a horrible, I can't go too far with this because I lack empathy and compassion sometimes.
Right.
But don't
Yeah.
so don't do that. Don't be like AJ. Have empathy, have compassion. Speak kindly to people, but still be direct. I mean, you've got to lead.
That's right. Such a good point you're making. One of the things that we do in our core values process, AJ, is we identify, these unvalues or anti-values, things that we don't want to be anymore.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about this on the podcast before. And it's so helpful to have those things. So if you, like, let's say you identify that one of your core values is the status quo, maintaining the status quo, and you want to move away from that. Well, when someone brings something up in a leadership team meeting that would be evidence of maintaining the status quo, it helps to have had that core values discovery process, because then you can point at it. We often will say, make a sign, make an actual sign that you bring to leadership team meetings with your anti-values or unvalues on them. So you can point to it and say, I think that would be contributing to that maintaining the status quo unvalue that we have, or anti-value that we have. And so we shouldn't do that. We're not going to do that. That, to your point, AJ, it gives you something objective to point to, so you're not just coming across like a jerk. At the same time, I think people can handle the truth, even if their feelings are hurt in the moment. It's much more damaging long-term to not be direct and tell people the truth and do something different than what you said.
Yeah.
So if you say, oh yeah, if you're always saying, oh, I'm going to think about that, that's a really good idea, Bob.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great insight. And then you never act on anything Bob says. Do you think that builds trust with Bob? It doesn't. And so, and it's really hard to undo that, because if your relationship is built on couching language that isn't truthful, and that's the pattern that you set up with Bob, it's very difficult to undo that. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
He's just going to assume that now, whenever you say anything, he can't trust you. So,
well, I think over time this gets better. I think you'll have, if you can get solid on clear communication, and I'm kind of thinking from a staff leadership perspective. Okay. So you're pastor of a church or a staff leader in a church, and you've got lots of people that come to you and you need to make decisions and you need to talk about things. I think if you can get on this track of clear and decisive communication, over time, you're going to be faced with less things that even need conversation. If we're like, hey, pastor, how about we do this? And you're like, oh, yeah, maybe. Hey, pastor, how about we do this? Maybe. And you are always, oh, yeah, maybe. The team is always going to be continually throwing things at you. If you're clear and you're like, no, that's not, that would pull us off target. You do that for a while, pretty soon there's going to be less, how about this, how about this, how about this? Because the team understands, I mean, what have we gained? We've gained clarity in mission and vision, and how you want to lead and how you want them to do their jobs. And so it will get easier over time, because people will come to understand really and be more unified as a team. Where are we going?
Yeah, I've told this story on this podcast before, and I tell this story several times in working with churches, and about how on staff at a church that I worked at several years ago, we were doing an outreach initiative, AJ, and we had put a team together to help plan that outreach. And so I went to one of their planning meetings to kind of get caught up to speed on what they had decided and what they had planned. And we're talking about t-shirts and how we needed to order more church t-shirts so that everyone that was going to participate could have them. And I said, no, we're not doing that. We're not wearing t-shirts. We're not wearing them. And they said to me, one of the ladies said, well, we decided that we're going to wear them. And I just looked at her and the group and said, you don't get to decide that. That's not yours to decide. And when I tell that story, some people go, well, how'd that work out for you? Well, actually worked out fine. Like, I didn't get fired. She didn't leave the church. In fact, later on, she ended up becoming the church administrator later. She ended up coming on staff years later. So it was fine. And the reason it was fine is because I was direct. If I had said, oh, yeah, you know what, that's a good thing for us to think about, and then I had gone around and then we didn't do it, that team would have felt betrayed. People can handle the truth. What they can't handle is you going or skirting an issue and then making a decision behind their back. People can't handle that, and they won't trust you. And I also was not, it was a direct conversation with that team, AJ. It was not a rude conversation. I explained, cast the vision for why we're not doing that. This is about building relationship with the community. It's not about promoting our church. It's about doing the right thing. It's not about trying to make a show of it. And so it was fine. It was fine. But what would have been wrong would have been for me to say, that's a good idea. Let's think about that. And then do something different.
Yeah.
That would have been wrong.
All right. So number one, communicate promptly with people. Don't let things just hang out there unanswered. Number two, communicate with kindness, but with clarity and decisiveness so that we can just move on from where we are now and keep going. Number three, follow through. Do what you say. If you're going to make a decision, you're going to say this is the way we're going to do things, or this idea is something that we're going to start, then get busy.
Yep. You have to do it. Back up your words. Worked with the church last year in 2019 that had made a key programming. This was before I had worked with them. They made a key programming shift that they hadn't communicated well about. In sort of retrospect, looking back, the mistakes they made were communication mistakes, but they had made a decision. Well, then they had got a ton of blowback. They basically were cutting out some programs. Got a ton of blowback from a certain segment of folks. And AJ, they went back on it. They were like, never mind. You can't do that.
Yeah.
You can apologize they should have communicated better and differently. But they made the right decision. The programs that they were eliminating needed to be eliminated. And for all the right reasons, they just did a really poor job communicating it. Mm-hmm. They could have dealt with that communications disaster without going back on what they said they were going to do.
Yeah, that's a failure that we often see in the implementation phase of a strategic envisioning process with a church, is that the leadership fails to continue to have, the stick-to-itiveness to keep going on change. And so maybe the audience is like, what does this have to do with communication? Well, your actions communicate sometimes louder than your words. And we're saying both in this case. We're talking about clarity in our words and clarity in our actions. And that's doing what we've said that we were going to do. Huge leadership point in making sure that you can continue to have a team with you. I mean, this is an area in which you can lose team unity and team effectiveness in your church or your ministry. So can't be overlooked, and it's not a sideline to communication. It's a key element of communication.
People will not keep following you if you don't do what you say you're going to do. They're just not. And so if you say we're making a change, make the change. If you say I've made a decision, make the decision. This is what the Bible talks about, right? Like James talks about this. Don't be blown by the wind. Mm-hmm. Every time something comes along and you go, you're an unstable leader and people don't want to follow you. It doesn't mean that you can't change your mind or whatever. Things happen, but you need to communicate then why you're doing something differently. Go, I had made this decision. I have this new information. Now I'm making a new decision, and this is why. The other thing that's important is to own up to your mistakes, AJ. I mean, all of us have been guilty of not following through on something. We said we were going to get a piece of information to somebody, and then we forgot about it and didn't do it, or whatever. And when that happens, don't make an excuse. Just say, I made a mistake. I forgot. I was supposed to do that. Let me make it right. I'll get it done today.
Yeah.
Don't lie and say, oh, I got too busy, or, that's so-and-so's fault. Don't do that. Just tell the truth. Say, I meant to do this. I said I was going to. I made a mistake. I'm going to fix it.
Yeah, there you go. Bonus principle number 4, come up with on the fly by Scott Ball over there. So
I think it's connected. If you fail to follow through,
yeah,
then you got to own that mistake.
it's the other side of the coin of doing what you say, but that's maintaining integrity in your leadership. So I think that's great. So yeah, again, communicate promptly with your team. Make sure that you're not letting things linger. Stop the language that's ambiguous and just let your yes be yes and your no be no, and then do what you say and have the integrity as a leader to own up whenever maybe things didn't work out or that you maybe failed in some aspect of your leadership. I think these are some great principles for communication. And as our Christmas gift to you this week, this is maybe a little bit shorter episode, so you can focus on communicating clearly with your team after you end listening to this. So,
hey, one thing I want to say, AJ, before we wrap this up.
Yeah.
You mentioned this earlier in the podcast episode that it's helpful to have some objective things you can point to when you want to speak clearly and when you're making a decision. And the church ministry analysis is one such tool. So you might be going, I don't know about, a whole drawn out church strategic planning process yet, or if we're ready for it, or even if our people would see the need for that right now. But the church ministry analysis gives you a hard, concrete, objective score in the 6 areas of church health. And we are providing those for churches now because of the generosity of our donors and because we're a nonprofit. That service, which used to cost over $1,000, is now just $99. So very accessible. Hopefully churches don't have to go through finance team or jump through any red tape at their church in order to decide to do that. And churches right now are scheduling for January. They're onboarding meetings and getting started. So we want to encourage you to do that. Know that if you go to malfirstgroup.com/CMA, that stands for Church Ministry Analysis, malfirstgroup.com/CMA, you can go ahead and pay that $99 and then start the process and schedule for January, or we even have some times available before the end of the year.
Yeah, that's not, you're not going to click buy now, answer some questions and get an email report sent to you 30 seconds later. We actually do these custom. So yeah, we've got a really, really thought out set of questions in 6 key ministry health areas. We help you assemble the right survey group to take it. We collect all that information. We put together a custom report for you, and then we meet with your leadership team to discuss it afterwards. So this is a fully customized and guided service from our team to your team. So I hope you take advantage of that. malfirstgroup.com/CMA. So this has been episode 68 of the Church Revitalization Podcast. Thanks for being with us. You can read today's show notes at malfirstgroup.com/68, the number of this episode. And we'll be back again with you next week as we march towards Christmas 2020 and celebrate the birth of our Savior. So thankful for his sacrifice for our church and yours in your ministry as well. We continue to pray for you and your leadership and the ministry that God's placed in your care. Scott, thanks for being with us again this week. Looking forward to marching into 2021 with you.
Absolutely. We'll see you next week, guys.